So if we talk about the procurement of services as basically the procurement of a service from an organization that is going to deliver an output engaged under a statement of work contract.
Yep.
And this is, you get some people who will readily use the term SOW, and you get other people in the services procurement industry who really don't like that phrase because ultimately it's just the contract. I do think it's a great central point to come back to, because you get this kind of black and white scenario where you say, if it's contracted under a statement of work, it fits in that box. And if it doesn't, it's quite possibly something else. So I think there's a value to that. But on the basis of the services procurement, there's a different set of problems, or there is a specific set of problems that organizations have in addressing that. You obviously will have heard a lot of this from end customers from the research side of it, and also looking at the solutions that technology providers are trying to put forward. What do you see as those main problems being for organizations?
Yeah, I mean, from what I have seen, and you're referring to specifically procuring services, is that correct? Yeah. So, I mean, based on some data that I've seen from my discussions, interestingly, the problems are very basic. Those that seem to rise to the top are, first of all, visibility into services. So there isn't there isn't really organizations are not very good at understanding, where services spend is happening, first of all, and being able to analyze it. Getting visibility is generally the top problem that they cite in terms of a challenge for, getting some handle on services.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's in some ways the problems are basic, but the area that those problems are part of is incredibly complex. It's like if you look at the difference between buying goods and materials, and I've certainly taken a real interest in this from a technology point of view and from a process point of view, because our technology specifically focuses on just the procurement of service, rather than the procurement of goods and materials. Yep. If you look at that's why I would always espouse the fact that there's different technology required for the different things, because if you're buying goods and materials, it's fairly binary in some ways, in the sense you're buying a certain number of things. The things have to be the thing that's specified. They need to be of the right quality and delivered on time and all that sort of thing. However, there is complexity in the supply chain, significant complexity in the supply chain. And that's where existing procurement technology is, in my opinion, pretty good at managing that. When you're dealing with buying services, in most cases, there's less of that supply chain complexity. But there's a giant amount of complexity that's very fluid, in the sense that of what it could be, what's being delivered. Every single project theoretically is different in some way. Obviously, you get repeatable stuff that's at the bottom end in the tail spend, but generally there's just this giant scope. So although the problems of things like visibility, compliance, control, all these sorts of things are fairly basic problems, they're just so complex because service is complex. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, the fact that, these very fundamental problems are those that rise to the top, indicates how much there is to be done beyond just getting some handle on those. But absolutely, I think that services is it's something that is to some degree intangible, as you say. It's it's all about the contract, really, and the specifications, and being able to determine and control and ensure that the outputs or the results are being delivered. I think that's services in a nutshell, services procurement in a nutshell.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so in the same way as the fact that the problems are in some ways basic, fundamental. I think the solutions are as well. The solutions need to be as well, in the sense that you're addressing those basic problems. But it's like, I just made a note then that you referred to the intangibles. And I think really the problem-solving exercise in addressing services procurement is trying to make those intangibles tangible and measurable, and
exactly.
trying to be able to deal with the nuance and complexity of all these different services that could be provided by different provider types.
I agree.
But that's where I think the statement of work is hugely important, because it all comes back to that. And ultimately, I think at the moment, my opinion in terms of the maturation of this or the market maturity as it currently stands, a lot of companies really have no handle on this whatsoever. Some companies are doing okay at managing a kind of source to contract process, but very, very few companies that we see are able to manage the kind of full source to pay process effectively. Stuff seems to get lost at the point of contract. And that's, I think, where, from a technology point of view, the problem-solving exercise needs to address specific issues around this complexity and nuance and the huge variation. But ultimately, it comes back to, can you define effectively what needs to be delivered? Can you capture that? And then you need to make sure that goes through to the delivery phase. And in a lot of cases, we hear anecdotal, stories from CPOs, CFOs, etc., where, okay, we're looking at doing some work with provider X. What did they do for us in the last year? No one really knows. The CPO will almost definitely know how much you spent with them in total, but they won't necessarily know what the projects were, whether they're on time, on budget, how much scope creep, all this sort of stuff. So I think, in a situation where some procurement teams are having to actually literally look at physical statements of work or dig them out to try and understand this information, there's a fairly simple problem-solving exercise of taking that information into delivery, but it's a specific problem that's kind of being addressed now. So we'll come on to how that's being addressed in a minute. But I think there's also the idea that generally, if you're buying goods and materials, there's not usually, I'm sure there's some instances where this is the case, but there aren't usually changes partway through. So if I order 50 red widgets, it's unlikely that I'm going to change that to something completely different halfway through the order.
Right. There might be changes in quantities or price or something like that, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, one of the unique problems around, or the specific problems around the way that services are procured, is that change process is a huge part of it. And it can, because half the time when you're trying to do something, you don't know where it's going to end up. Is that something that you see?
Oh, definitely. And I think to your point, the kind of the source to contract process is something that probably gets a lot of focus. And although even that, as you mentioned, is not being done that very well, but in many organizations, but the post-contract, contract to delivery and contract to pay, that is just, there's not very much, I think that's where there's a tremendous deficit in practices today. Interestingly, as you were talking, I was thinking about, for procurement, which generally is handling and trying to manage services, if at all. I think that procurement is not geared to being able to track and manage post-contract. It's not what they do. They buy, and sure, they're interested in the results of what is bought, but they're not. Procurement is not geared to manage the engagement and the deliverables of a services engagement.